When the victim falls for the captor, the psychological mystery of Stockholm. In August 1973, a bank robbery unfolded in the heart of Stockholm, Sweden. Armed criminals stormed Kreditbanken and took 4 hostages, locking them inside the bank's vault for 6 long days and nights. As the entire nation of Sweden held its breath, waiting for police to break in and rescue the hostages, no one could have predicted what would shock the world most. It wasn't the dramatic police raid. It was the strange reaction of the victims themselves. Not only did they refuse to testify against their captors, one of them even raised money to hire a lawyer to defend the very man who once held a gun to her head. What happened behind the cold steel doors of that bank vault? Why did people who were threatened, terrified, and held against their will suddenly develop sympathy, even affection, for their captors? Was this just a rare, isolated case? Or did it reveal a darker, hidden layer of the human psyche? This story began in Stockholm, but it reached deep into the instincts of survival, the pain of isolation, and the desperate human need for connection. And from it, a new term was born. Stockholm Syndrome, like a mirror reflecting the paradoxes buried within the human mind. In a normal society, people instinctively distance themselves from those who hurt them. But in certain extreme situations, something deeply paradoxical happens. Victims begin to form emotional bonds, even love, for the very person who threatens their life. This isn't madness. It's an ancient survival mechanism hardwired into the human brain. Stockholm Syndrome is a psychological phenomenon in which victims of kidnapping, abuse, or psychological manipulation develop empathy, affection, or even loyalty toward their abuser. The emotional bond can become so intense that victims don't try to escape. In fact, they might defend, sympathize with, or even fall in love with their captor. But why would the human mind work this way? When someone is trapped, threatened, and completely isolated in a hostile environment, their brain switches into survival mode. In that state, every thought narrows down to one simple question: how do I stay alive? In this mindset, even the smallest act of kindness from the captor, a sip of water, a forced smile, a moment without pain, becomes something precious. The victim begins to see hope in the same person who's imprisoning them. Over time, they form an emotional attachment to this lifeline, not out of love, but out of fear, confusion, and the desperate need to feel safe. When you can't escape the situation, you adapt to it. And when the only human interaction you have is with your captor, then ironically, that person becomes the least threatening presence in your world. What's truly disturbing is that Stockholm Syndrome doesn't just happen in hostage cases. It shows up in toxic relationships all around us. A domestic abuse victim stays believing he only hits me when he's angry. A cult member remains loyal, thinking at least the leader gives us food and shelter. An overworked employee stays loyal to an abusive boss because sometimes he can be nice. The common thread? The abuser mixes threats with care, making it nearly impossible for the victim to clearly recognize the danger. In the end, many choose to side with their abuser as a way to feel safe, even when they're not. Factors that make Stockholm Syndrome stronger. 1. Long periods of isolation from the outside world. 2. Total control over the victim's physical and emotional needs. 3. No contact with anyone else. Occasional acts of kindness by the captor, like providing food or not inflicting harm. The victim starts seeing outsiders, police, family, society, as the true threat. The scariest part? Stockholm Syndrome can take hold without the victim ever realizing it. They may believe their feelings are genuine, mutual, and voluntary. In some cases, they even refuse to leave when rescued, or return to the same toxic dynamic, convinced it's love. Stockholm Syndrome isn't love. It's emotional confusion born from hunger. Hunger for life, for hope, and for human connection. The Stockholm Syndrome doesn't just exist in theory or textbooks. It has happened many times in the real world, leaving behind stories that stunned humanity. The 1973 Stockholm bank robbery. Norrmalmstorg Square in Stockholm. Armed with a machine gun and explosives, he took four on August 23, 1973. Jan Erik Olsson, an escaped convict, walked into Creditbanken at bank employees hostage. For 6 tense days, he demanded that his friend Clark Olofsson be released from prison. And strangely, the demand was granted. Instead of storming in, the police surrounded the building. During the standoff, the hostages began talking, sharing, and even laughing with their captor. When they were rescued on the 6th day, the world was stunned. The hostages hugged the captor as he was arrested. They criticized the police for being too aggressive. One hostage even said, "I didn't hate him, I hated the police." Christina Enmark, the main hostage, said in an interview, "He didn't kill us. He was kind, gave us food, talked to us, and reassured us. It was the police who scared me." Christina later visited Clark Olofsson in prison regularly and maintained until her death that she was not brainwashed. She genuinely felt connected to him. Patty Hearst, the heiress turned national criminal. Patty Hearst, a 19-year-old heiress from a wealthy media family, lived a luxurious life until February 1974, when she was kidnapped from her apartment by a radical armed group known as the SLA, Symbionese Liberation Army. For over 50 days, she was locked in a closet, beaten, raped, and brainwashed with revolutionary propaganda. Gradually, Patty stopped resisting. When she reappeared in public, she wore a black beret, held a gun, shouted slogans, and robbed the Hibernia Bank alongside the SLA. A photo of her standing with the terrorists shocked the nation. Her family insisted she had been manipulated and controlled, but the government still sentenced her to 7 years in prison. However, after many psychological evaluations, President Bill Clinton granted her a full pardon in 2001, officially recognizing her as a victim of Stockholm Syndrome and systemic brainwashing. "I'm no longer Patty Hearst, I'm Tanya, and I fight for the truth," she told reporters when arrested. Natasha Kampusch, the girl who lived in a basement for 8 years. Natasha was abducted on a spring morning in 1998 while walking to school. She was only 10 years old. Wolfgang Priklopil, an electrical engineer, locked her in a secret 5-square-meter basement room, with no light or sound from the outside world. He controlled her every move, every meal, and even her thoughts. At first, she was beaten and psychologically tormented. But over time, They began having breakfast together, watching TV, and even walking in the garden under supervision. After 8 years, Natasha escaped when Priklopil let his guard down. But instead of hating him, she cried when she learned he had committed suicide. In an interview, she said, "I know he wasn't well. I don't forgive, but I don't hate. He was a part of my childhood I cannot separate from." The public was shocked. How could a victim feel sympathy for her abductor? But that is the core of Stockholm Syndrome. When prolonged isolation and despair lead people to form emotional connections, even with those who have imprisoned them. In all 3 cases, the public initially blamed the victims, calling them naive or deluded. But psychological experts stepped in and explained, this is not a voluntary choice. It is a survival mechanism of the brain in extreme conditions. To survive, victims learn to love the very cage that holds them. The Stockholm Syndrome isn't just a weird psychological phenomenon people bring up in lectures or workshops for fun. It is a mirror reflecting a hidden corner of the human psyche. A place where survival instinct meets emotion, where fear mixes with faint hope, and where love can be twisted so much that victims begin to empathize with those who harm them. We often associate Stockholm Syndrome with terrifying hostage situations like the one in Sweden, or high-profile cases like Patty Hearst or Natasha Kampusch. But the truth is, this effect may quietly exist in the relationships around us every day. A woman trapped in an abusive relationship for years who still says, "He's just hot-tempered sometimes, but he loves me." A child constantly scolded and controlled by their parents, yet believes, "Mom does this because she loves me." An employee exploited at work but still feels lucky just to have a job. These are milder forms, yet still bear the markings of Stockholm. When someone is put in a powerless position for too long, isolated, hurt, and stripped of autonomy, they may begin to develop loyalty, affection, and even love for their controller, as a way to adapt and survive. In normal conditions, most people say, "If it were me, I'd fight back. I'd never fall in love with my captor." But psychology shows people don't act rationally when faced with survival. When a person is trapped in isolation, deprived of freedom, and constantly threatened, the brain activates a survival mechanism. Any act of kindness from the captor, a meal, rest, not being hit, is interpreted by the brain as salvation. And from there, emotions become distorted and dependent. This is not love, it is warped emotion born from fear and despair. The terrifying part is, Stockholm victims often don't realize they're being hurt. They will find reasons, defend, and even justify their abuser. They may resist those trying to help them, and that's why outsiders often judge them, labeling them as foolish, weak, or pathetic. The truth is, Stockholm victims don't need criticism. They need understanding. We, as a society, as friends, as family, need to learn to recognize red flags in relationships, avoid blaming, and instead ask gentle questions like, "Are you truly happy? If you could choose again, what would you do?" Build mental support networks so those caught in Stockholm cycles no longer feel alone. The Stockholm Syndrome is a wake-up call. It reminds us that pain can distort feelings, and not all love is true love. If you've ever felt you aren't allowed to express your true feelings, You keep apologizing for things you didn't do. You stay with someone not out of love, but out of fear of being abandoned. Pause. Ask yourself, is this love born from dependency or from the heart? Don't fall in love with the cage just because it has a window. Don't love your captor just because he gave you a piece of bread.